And we're back. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And as I talked about at the top of the show, I want to dive a little bit into the announcement by Amazon this past week to uh, begin re-implementing a 5-day a week return to office policy, or essentially, returning back to the way that they worked prior to the pandemic, prior to the COVID pandemic, which started in March of 2020. So it's been, basically 4.5 years. They are giving about a 90-day grace periods. They said they're going to start in January of 2025 to give people some flexibility to adjust to what they did. Basically they called out two specific things that they're trying to do with their policy, and again they frame it as sort of an update to the company. So this wasn't entirely about work from home. So there really was sort of two pieces to it. The first was they announced that they have added too much headcount. They have gotten a little too big, a little too bureaucratic, a little too, sort of uh, bloated, if you will, right? Without maybe necessarily using those words. But essentially what they said was, we've got too many people that are just managing groups, maybe getting in the way of process. And so the first thing they were going to do was they were going to increase the ratio of individual contributors to managers by 15%. So if you were a manager, you were going to have 15% more people reporting to you than you do before. Now, how they were going to go about implementing that, they didn't necessarily say. It could be that they ask a number of managers to move back to being individual contributors. That's possible. They also could, just lay off a number of managers, and the managers whose teams were affected would then sort of roll up to other people, and you get to that 15% number. So, all of this, at least the first part of the thing, was talked about in the context of trying to increase efficiency, reduce bureaucracy, improve their ability to get back to sort of the Amazon culture that drove great stock returns and great market share and so forth. So that doesn't really come as a surprise. Basically, the entire time that Andy Jassy's been CEO, that's essentially been kind of what he's been focused on, right? In essence, Amazon, when the pandemic took off, was probably one of the largest hirers. They added just an enormous number of people. Tried to take advantage of the market situation, tried to, take advantage of their financial acumen at the time, and grow in areas that they thought they could, coming out of the pandemic, whenever that thing might have been, or if it was going to become the new normal, they'd be better positioned in the markets that they wanted to go after. So, a lot of what Andy has been, tasked with, or what he's been focused on since taking over in basically July of 2021, I believe, has been, dealing with the fact that they really overhired. They got, sort of bloated in certain areas. So he's been doing a lot of sort of cutting, adjusting, reallocating resources, trying to drive accountability across the business. So, this first part of the announcement, in terms of, trying to have, less managers, perceived to be people who maybe aren't necessarily doing the work. They're sort of middle tier of people who kind of get in the way. And that makes a lot of sense. That sort of aligns very much with the Amazon culture of, you build it, you operate it. We want builders in the organization. We want less people that are in the way of, getting, having decisions get made and then actions being taken. So, that piece of it wasn't a surprise by any means. It's very much been in line with what Andy's been focused on the whole time. The second part of it, though, has raised quite a bit of attention, and maybe it's just simply for Amazon, right? Maybe it's not necessarily something that the rest of us should necessarily care about. But essentially, what they said was, we would like to get back to the culture that created Amazon, or the culture that was dominant in the 2010s and kind of pre-COVID. And they believe that part of that is happens when they have people full-time in the office. And Amazon's one of those companies, and there's a number of them. Google was very much this way, in which the preponderance of people who work there, the vast majority of people who work there across lots of different functions, not just Amazon, but lots of different functions, retail and video and all sorts of other things. You had to work in the Amazon office, and this was something that I know Aaron and I have had some familiarity with, in talking to them over the years about potential jobs and other things. For us, it was always a no starter because we didn't necessarily want to live in Seattle, or it might have been Northern Virginia, or any of those things. And so we always chose not to work there, just not out of not wanting to work there, not out of opportunity, but really just because we enjoyed living in North Carolina. And for Amazon pre-COVID, that was a deal breaker. That was a no starting thing, and so that was fine. I think people kind of understood that. Now, what was interesting, obviously, is when COVID started, they allowed people to work from home because health reasons and all sorts of other things. And so, and that was not by any means unique in the tech industry or unique anywhere else in the world. Now, what I think is sort of unique in the tech industry, and I want to put this into context because I don't want this to be a show in which we're critical about Amazon's decision. People can be critical about it for various reasons. So, for example, if you are a caregiver, if you're somebody who said, look, over the last 4.5 years, I've been very effective at my job. I've been working from home. I've saved myself 2 hours a day commuting into the office, an hour each way or 45 minutes each way, whatever your commute might be. And that time has been allocated towards work. And you might say, look, my life is essentially set up around, working from home lifestyle, right? Whether that's, you're a caregiver for small children. So let's say you're a single mom, you've allocated things. Maybe you are just a, part of a family, and you've, you sort of rearranged your life around these last 4.5 years. Or potentially you've said, well, there was no indication prior to, maybe a year ago, and you had the financial means, or you had the ability to move somewhere. And you were like, hey, I've been doing my job. So, this is where I think the crux of the debate really comes in, is an individual assessment of whether or not you believe you're still capable of being effective in the job, versus the company saying, this is the way that we think it's most effective for the biggest number of people to be there. And I did a little bit of looking around, just at some numbers. And again, these are really, really, really basic, sort of cherry picking of a few things. But if we look at, let's say, the last 4 years of Amazon, right? So if we go back to, say, March of 2020, when COVID first started, their stock rose significantly from, let me see if I got the numbers in front of me. Basically rose from, let's see, March of 2020. This is not great podcasting, but March of 2020, stock was $120 at the peak of sort of the pandemic, and in the middle of the pandemic. So August of 22, stock got up to about $160. So it grew quite a bit. Some of that's probably split adjusted, I believe. But so it grew 120 to 160. So it grew about a third, right? And then people started to realize, okay, this pandemic is going to have an end in sight, right? We're seeing vaccines, we're seeing some people return to traveling and interacting with other people. Again, almost a year and a half into this, and then their stock sort of came crashing back down to 100, or it came down to, let's call it, $95, $97. This was sort of the beginning of 2023. So, stock went from 120 at the beginning, grew to 160, dropped back down to 95, maybe 100. So yes, there was some fluctuation in there, and that was all during the time in which people were working from home. And then since then, since they've implemented this new policy, which really kind of went into effect sort of December of 2022, stock was at $87. And if we look at it now, they've been at sort of 3 days a week. The stock is $189. So basically, let's just call it doubled since they went back to this 3 day a week. So, at the most basic level, they could sort of argue, well, while we were working from home, in the upside of the pandemic, things grew. People thought Amazon was going to take even more share than they did. We started working from home. We went through some things. The stock went down. Now, again, a lot of that's probably attributed to they hired too many people. But since they've implemented this sort of new thing, you could sort of point to the fact that, okay, we put this policy in place 3 day a week, and the stock has been up, 2x, right? It went from basically $90 to $190, so a little more than 2x. Now, could you attribute all that to return to work? No, not necessarily, right? Like, a lot of that has to do with, the economy recovering, has to do with, them being more efficient in how they run their business and all sorts of other things. But, at the most basic level, you could kind of argue, well, if I look at the data, that's kind of what's happened. Now, again, that is a super simplistic view of things. Now, the other thing that a lot of people are talking about, and again, this is where I kind of get into, we're not criticizing, we're not necessarily evaluating whether this was a good thing for Amazon or not. But the other thing people are saying is this is an opportunity for them to basically say, well, this is a new policy. And again, I don't know all the details of what their 3-day return to office versus 5-day return to office, how much exceptions they had, how flexible they were about people that weren't in the major hubs versus, having moved, or whether it was department by department. But this does allow them a little bit of flexibility in terms of, one of the most costly things that you can have happen is to do a big layoff, right? And they've sort of signaled to the market a number of times that, hey, we're still too many people, we're still too inefficient. As I talked about the sort of the first half of this letter that was sent by Annie Jassy. And so this does give them a little bit of flexibility to do a couple of things. If you announce a mass layoff, number one, you typically have to pay some significant amount of severance to people, anywhere from, again, it depends on the thing. I've seen anywhere from 2 weeks to a week for every year that you've been there. I've seen companies do a year. I've seen companies do 2 years. So, if you lay off 10,000 people, 5,000, I mean, Amazon is a very, very large company, hundreds of thousands of its employees, especially when you get into all the factories and all those other sort of, or not the factories, the warehouses and other things. Laying off 10,000 people, 15,000 people is a fairly significant amount of money, right? And if you could use the policy and be like, well, if people don't want to come in, if they arbitrarily choose not to work in the way that we want them to work, we don't have to lay them off. They're essentially choosing to quit because it doesn't fit them anymore. It is a corporate way of doing selective layoffs or silent layoffs that don't necessarily get reported as layoffs, or even if they are reported as loss of employees, you're doing it at a much cheaper rate than you would have otherwise, right? The other thing that's been speculated, and I don't know how much of this is true, because if they've been doing at least 3-day a week return to office, you have typically, especially with larger organizations, the state or the local government typically will give those businesses tax breaks, corporate tax breaks, because if you've got people working in the area, those people are also, generating income. Therefore, they're generating taxes for the local base. And so, there may be aspects of this, and again, not specific to Amazon, but at a corporate level, where there are corporate tax advantages or sort of tax true ups for having a certain number of employees working, or a certain number of employees in a certain area. And so this is one of these interesting situations in which right now, if you were to say, hey, well, how's the hiring market in the tech space, you would say it's not great. It's soft. We're hearing stories of people going through dozens and dozens of interviews to find a job. People are not necessarily making the same amount of money that they were 5 years ago. And again, some of that is relative, because people were making a ton of money, maybe too much relative to the market. But they're announcing this at a time when the market is soft. There's always sort of a who's got more control of the situation. Is it more the employer or the employees? I would say right now the employers probably have greater leverage over their employees. And so it seems to be that Amazon is attempting to do things at a business level that align to Andy's biggest sort of charters and focus areas, which is to get the business more effective. They are using the idea of, if the more we work together, the more we embrace the Amazon culture, the more we're going to be innovative and respond to our customers. That very well may be true. And Amazon is a very, very data-driven company. I think the question that will be interesting to watch is not so much, should we analyze what Amazon is doing? They're their own business; they make their own decisions. But will we see a lot of other companies in the tech industry, in particular, start to emulate this, right? And tech is one of those industries in which, as a workforce, we've adapted really, really well to remote work, right? So much of the work that we do is sort of knowledge work. You don't necessarily have to be, in a physical location. Yes, there can be times when working together with your colleagues is useful, but we adapt really well to telework or remote work. We adapt very well to sort of having, longer hours as it is. And, so I think it's going to be a very interesting thing to sort of watch, because, pre-pandemic, Amazon was one of those companies that was, highly, highly watched, was considered to be very, very industry changing. And it will be interesting to see if, we see more and more tech companies kind of go back to this, decide that their growth is not going fast enough, and they believe that the way to fix that will be, through return to office. So it's going to be interesting. It's definitely something that has more significant impact to certain types of individuals. Again, depending on how important you are at caring for your family, caring, whether those are young children or sort of elderly people, whether you have had the flexibility to move somewhere away from one of the large cities, maybe a Boston or a Seattle or San Francisco or something, that gave you a better standard of life than you liked before, or just a different life than you wanted before. How much flexibility you'll have to continue to work remote. So I think it's gonna be very interesting. I think the timing of it again is interesting, because again the market has sort of shifted to where the leverage is more for the employer than the employee. There's some uncertainty about the economy with elections and all those sort of things. The economy still does seem to be fairly strong. We've seen rate cuts and so forth, but yeah, it's going to be one of those things where will this be Amazon specific? Will we see companies waiting multiple quarters to sort of see the results come? If they start in January, are they going to be looking at this in April and July and Q1, Q2? Will it be something that Amazon highlights? Will they find a way to sort of create a metric around, hey, the more collaborative we are, we're seeing certain things happen? Or will this just sort of, kind of get swept under the rug and we won't really think much about it? And Amazon will be Amazon and they'll have their growth rate the way they will. So anyways, just something to sort of keep an eye on. Again, when one of the largest companies in the industry makes some moves, we'll see if they still continue to have kind of the power to shift markets, or to be, considered a sort of a lighthouse, or a thought leader, or a, kind of structural leader, and do other companies follow, or do companies just sort of follow it to see if it makes sense for their business? And I think that's really good. What's going to be the interesting decision is, do we sort of see people follow in sort of a sheep manner, or do we see them really, trying to understand their business specifically? Have they been effective with work from home people? Have they been effective with more flexible return to office? Do they start to look at creative ways in which they create new hubs, so that, people, don't necessarily have to spend as much time commuting, or other types of things like that. So anyways, just something to sort of keep an eye on. We're always trying to find the right balance between covering technology, covering the people that have to build and support the technology, and then the economics around it. So this is one of those topics that really touches all three of them. So anyways, with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. Again, I apologize if my voice seems a little hoarse, doing a lot of traveling this month. I think I figured I'm traveling about 40,000 miles between beginning of September and sort of middle of November before Thanksgiving. So quite a bit on my plate, but lots of things to talk about. So thank you all for listening. As always, thanks for telling a friend. We got a really nice award from, or at least a recognition from, one of the industry analyst firms as one of the top 5 innovative podcasts. So thank you all for listening, and thanks for telling a friend. Your support of the show drives things like that. So it's very rewarding for us. So anyways, with that, we'll wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.